Hey everybody, this is John with MTG Nexus coming at you with primarily a companion discussion as well as brief mentions of the BNR announcement today in Historic and Standard, as this is primarily a Modern channel and Pioneer. We're going to be focusing primarily on its effects on Modern and Pioneer as far as the effects of this new companion rule and briefly mention the bannings of Agent of Treachery and Fires have been mentioned. So today's BNR announcement, the big thing was the change to the companion rule. A lot of people were curious how it would affect things, whether, you'd go down a card, put it in your hand. The effective change ended up becoming, and this is verbatim from the article, once per game, anytime you could cast a sorcery, so basically during your main phase when the stack is empty, you may pay 3 generic mana, put your companion from your sideboard into your hand. This is a special action, not an activated ability. Basically, that means that the ability cannot be reacted to. You cannot stifle it. You cannot, stop it with things like Phyrexian Revoker and stuff, as we'll get down. They had that later down in the article. And they banned Agent of Treachery and Fires of Invention. Effectively the same thing in Historic, although it remains to be seen if they have some type of counterplay to it. So, basically, their explanation is when rules aren't normally part of a ban mechanic, in this case we're introducing a change motivated by game balance and metagame share play across. Effective with this update, the companion mechanic will be working differently from before. One of the reasons is the play rates of formats and on player feedback to repetitive gameplay patterns. As a group, decks used companions have too high win rates and metagame shares in Standard, Pioneer, and Modern, and have always and already necessitated bans in Legacy and Vintage. The result is we intend to reduce the metagame of companion shares while also capturing the spirit of the mechanic to be worth building around in many cases. We've discussed several alternatives, but ultimately settled on this one as it best mitigates the potential of repetitive gameplay and provides a wider window of interaction. Next, this is an additional mana that will often slow down the turn, allowing the opponent to interact with it, in this case, blah blah blah. It is rare that we use rule change to address gameplay balance. This isn't something we plan to do in the future. We have plans to do in the future. In this case, the issue wasn't solved with one rather a group of as companions. We believe this solution is preferable, potentially needing to make multiple bans across 4 different formats over time. So, my own thoughts on companions before the change. So, a lot of people are complaining that companions made gameplay repetitive. And to a certain degree, this is true. And as we've homogenized down, we've started to realize that the grindier the decks became to answer other grinding effects. So, the beginning of companions, things, especially in Modern, things like Boros Burn, Boros Prowess, were playable decks. In fact, they were toward the top of the meta. And people started adapting to these decks, and then Lurrus decks became grindier and grindier. So effectively, it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Instead of the format opening up, formats started to begin to close down with certain of these decks, to the point where basically Red-Black Prowess was probably the only truly consistently playable version of Red in particular. People are homogenizing towards Yorion and Lurrus builds in especially Modern, Pioneer to a lesser extent. So this is kind of effectively a way to push Lurrus out of the format. The thing with Lurrus decks is Lurrus decks were based around the concept of playing cheap interactive spells, cheap permanents, and then using Lurrus to follow up to kind of keep the gas flowing. Initially, the presence of Lurrus in the format, while the companions were the same throughout the format, you were seeing a wide diversity of decks. Probably one of the widest diversity of decks you've seen in Modern, specifically, in quite some time. Decks that had kind of fallen by the wayside. Decks like Devoted Devastation, Ad Nauseam. A lot of decks that were kind of either coming back to fight the meta that had developed, or decks that kind of fallen out of favor because they get 1-for-1 by removal so far, and then once the printing of Fatal Push had come about, a lot of these creature combo decks had kind of taken a beating and gotten worse and worse over time. Even with the development of things like Veil of Summer, these decks were still having a rough time against decks like Jund. Blue-White X Control, especially when Blue-White X Control has basically gotten things like basically every card in their deck at this point over the last 2 years. So my thoughts on the mechanic itself what it effectively is done is put a soft ban on Lurrus. Now, you look at Lurrus, as we've discussed, sure, you can take a turn off and still put Lurrus into your hand, but then, your opponent has a turn, a thought sees it, prepare a counterspell, hold up their mana, etc., etc., etc. So, effectively, this puts a soft ban on Lurrus in a lot of these formats. Look at the other playable companions. Kahira, especially in Modern, only usually showed up in like creatureless control decks. Are they still willing to pay 6 mana for a 3/2? Probably not. And a lot of these decks could easily easily migrate to a Yorion build, which I'll get to in a second. Obosh is a weird one because Obosh, by the nature of it, has a spot on its curve where it's kind of dead. Like, they have that progression of 1-drop, what do you do on turn 2? 3-drop. Turn 4, what do you do? Turn 5. At turn 4, you could easily pay the 3 mana to get Obosh into your hand. So it's a little less of a downside. You should have a progression of 1-drop, another 1-drop, now tap land. Turn 3, play a 3-drop. Turn 4, play another 1-drop. Put Obosh in your hand, play Obosh. So, Obosh, not terribly affected by this, just because there was that turn 4 where you could potentially put Obosh in your hand. Now, does it certainly hurt? Yeah, but Obosh, I think, is still approachable as a card. Garuda, especially in Pioneer, this kills the deck. Garuda was predicated on speed and surprise. You went turn 1 tap land or turn whatever. Turn 2 play a dork. Turn 3 copy or play another dork. Turn 4 Garuda. Now you're set back an entire turn. In formats like Modern and Legacy, you have access to like things like Glittering Wish and such, or you can maybe mitigate things by paying some mana on turn 1. Especially in Legacy. So maybe it's not quite as effective in that, but in terms of Pioneer, this effectively kills that deck. It makes it a turn 5 combo deck, and it's just not good enough as a turn 5 combo deck with very little interaction. Maybe there are other like things you can do to set it up, but I think it effectively kills Garuda as a companion in specifically Pioneer. Finally, let's see, we've covered Lurrus, Garuda, Obosh, and there's Yorion, which I'll get to specifically in a second, and I think that covers about all the other. Zerda, kind of the same thing as a lot of these other decks. The few decks that have popped out around Zerda have basically been usually devoted devastation decks or Stoneforge Mystic decks, and paying 3 mana for that extra effect. Maybe it's still worth it because a lot of these decks play mana dorks and such, and maybe you can get away with kind of cheapening that cost in some spots. But overall, I think that kind of might kill that experimentation as well, because that wasn't particularly common. Finally, we get to Yorion. So, Yorion is effectively was the second most played companion in a lot of these formats. And Yorion decks in general are the slower go over the top mid-range decks. Whether they be blue-green X, whether they be some type of white-based mid-range and Pioneer. A lot of these will go over the top Planeswalker, get value from permanent-based things. And while I think this, especially in conjunction with the Fires ban, will hurt those decks in Standard and Historic, I don't know that the 3 cost really inhibits much in Modern and Pioneer. Specifically Modern. A lot of those decks wouldn't play Yorion until turn 6 or turn 7 anyway. And it's not terribly much for some of those decks to go, okay, turn 6, pay 3, hold up Archmage's Charm, or turn 4, play Urza, tap my lands, put my Yorion into my hand, still have up like a Metallic Rebuke, or turn 5, different progressions. Well, it certainly slows down the getting of Yorion in those decks. A lot of those decks are just accruing so much value from Yorion anyway that if they're playing if the game is already at a stalemate or close point, I think paying 3 extra mana for the Yorion effect for those decks is basically trivial. So, my personal opinion is the effect is this has put a soft ban on Luris, Garuda, Zerda, and Garuda, and basically made only Obosh and Yorion effectively the playable companions. And I think that's not necessarily a net positive. I appreciate what Wizards was trying to do here, and while it will certainly slow down and prevent the spread of a lot of what's going on, but I think this effectively makes Yorion the only significantly playable companion left. And I don't know, while it's going to prevent repetitive gameplay, I don't know that it's going to be healthy for formats. So, that's my thoughts. What are your guys' thoughts? Let me know down in the comment section down below. This has been John for MTG Nexus.